Okay. Okay, for those of you who read the email interaction, I'm going to try to remove this huge appendage in my mouth. One thing that I find is really interesting in all of this is that I actually 100% agree with everything that Jenna just said. 100%. Of all, the papers that I've read that Jenna herself has written, I would say are firmly in what I would consider ICTD. So I think a lot of the differences are actually ones of vocabulary, as Eric and Tim pointed out earlier this morning, and some of them are actually a little bit of, definitely there is a mindset difference, and it's one that I've been struggling to understand myself for a long time. Let me start off with, this is Melissa's slide, and the way I see what happened was, okay, so I emphasized these elements, and then I think Jenna and I are agreed on a good chunk of these, although we might, quibble about a few things. And then the major questions are around, I think, these 4 elements. Now, I didn't include in that first draft of the paper, specific things addressing some of the concerns that Jenna had, and I think they should be included. And so what I'm going to do is focus on these particular things. Now, before I do that, I'm going to attempt to be a reasonable qualitative person and explain to you my personal biases. Okay, so my background is my formal background is all in hard sciences and technical background. So that immediately thrusts me into a positivist arena, and I believe there is a world out there, whether it's changing, about which there are general statements that you can make which tend to hold true, although they might change over time. I'm also in an industry which is about computers, and computers are really interesting in that they are trying to abstract the most general component of what you can do with a general purpose machine, and then spread them around as much as possible. And of course, I work for a company that is particularly good at this, and we think of ourselves as only looking for big, large markets of billions of people. Otherwise, it's not even worth considering as far as we're concerned. In addition, I work for Microsoft, the evil empire, and I'm a manager in a research lab. In addition, for among those of you who know me well, I'm kind of a Luddite. I actually don't believe that much in technology for development. I think technology can have an impact, but I don't think that it's the critical thing that's missing in a lot of these projects. And finally, especially with all the air travel I've been doing, I've become more and more of a misanthrope as time goes on. And so, in short, I would say, I'm Satan. So this is the background with which I'm going to discuss everything that is about to happen. So I'm going to talk about these things point by point. And these excerpts on the left are specifically from the initial document that I wrote, which I wrote initially for people in my group, and I thought it would have wider application, so I sent it out. What I was really looking for, and this might have already been the first thing, was to find a way to classify what good research was across disciplines. And I manage a group that's very multidisciplinary in nature. We have anthropologists, sociologists, economists, computer scientists, and so on, all on the same team. But I feel like there are certain things that hold true across different research areas. And one of them, I think, is what I consider rigor and verifiability and replicability potentially. And all that I mean by rigor is that there is a method to the research that is accepted by the given discipline as a way to do that research. Now, methodology tends to evolve, but I would say the old, all these disciplines that have had any kind of history have evolved methodologies that they believe in. And I think this is something that is dependent on the discipline. So I don't necessarily think that anthropologists should use an economist methodology, or that computer scientists should use the methodology of somebody in civil planning or something like that. The other thing is that when I talk about replicability, some of it is a little bit hypothetical, because even in the hard physical sciences, nothing is really 100% replicable the way you do the first experiment. And so it's kind of hypothetical in the sense that if you were there in the same spot, do you make your methodology clear enough that somebody else who's a reasonably well-trained person in that field would be able to have done similar study, and then hopefully 75%, 80% of the conclusions would be very similar to what you did. My sense is that if you can't say that, it's not clear to me why the the final written article has value, because you're basically saying, I observed something that nobody else is ever going to observe again. It's only true for that instant that I observed it. And I don't think that's what we're after, and I don't think even qualitative scientists are after that. And I think of thick description, which was one of the topics that was in there, as being a particular product of a methodology by certain classes of qualitative disciplines. And so I didn't really go into it in detail because I thought it's not something that applies to computer scientists. I also didn't go into what it means to do a good engineering project because I thought that doesn't apply to anthropologists. Okay, next. So applicability was another question. And this one is interesting. On the one hand, I have this feeling that, frankly, if anything has ICT and development in there, I think it's fair game. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be interested in that. I think one of the interesting things is what Jenna says, which is that, she's not necessarily explicitly looking for applications of her findings for development. But I actually think everything that she does has direct import and applicability, in that it would inform how somebody who might be interested in changing a particular reality would take that information and use it as part of the design. And so I actually think, in fact, one of the things that when I was writing this, I kept trying to think of a counterexample for how something would be not applicable. And I really couldn't think of one. I was thinking, for example, maybe you write a paper about Dallas Cowboy-style cheerleaders on TV in cricket shows in India, and how that impacts, rural villages. And, if you have something interesting to say about it, I'm pretty sure I could contrive a technology that would take advantage of that understanding and somehow help development. So I actually think this is one of these things where, even though we feel like we disagree, it's hard to actually find a practical situation where there's disagreement. And then finally, I think there's the point about generalizability. And so the one thing I want to say about this is very similar to what Jenna said at the end, where she said, I want to speak to generalizability. And it is a focus on this word, which I very, very intentionally put into the original document, which is that it's not that a single instance of work has to be immediately generalizable. But there's a certain way in which even a very focused study about a small group somewhere in the world and their relationship to technology still contributes to a larger understanding of humanity and how human beings interact with technology. So I'm going to try to illustrate this with a few schematic diagrams. So, this is my view of humanity in the context of its relationship to technology. And you might say, okay, we don't really know what it is out there, right? So really it's just this blank slate. Now, people who have a quantitative mind, and who I think some of Jenna's criticisms apply to, will paint a very broad, shallow stroke and say, look, we can approximately describe this like this. And this has pros and cons. On the one hand, it's not correct, right? If you look on this side, there's things happening which are not correct. On the other hand, it's not a bad approximation for overall what's happening. I would say, people who are, spending time doing ethnography are doing very deep, thick investigations into a particular aspect of this larger picture. Now, the interesting thing about this is how you might ask the question, how does this contribute to generalizability? And I actually think it does. So the fact is, even though this blob looks like the whole world, the reality is that the world is much larger. And this little dot helps you, for example, show how human beings are different from chimpanzees or Neanderthals or aliens or whatever, right? In other words, it's helping to plot out where humanity is as opposed to other different kinds of entities that might or might not use technology. And so I think already just by that single process of understanding a single culture or a single community, however small, it helps you understand the larger picture of the world. Now, in reality, what happens with qualitative research is that people do studies all over the world in different environments and different time periods and so on. And I think that basically helps to map out this larger picture, which again contributes to a kind of generalizability. If you were, started off with this picture of the world, and then there's certain kinds of work that say, well, actually, this doesn't hold true, right? And so people will actually look at different places where there are exceptions to things that quantitative social scientists might have found. And ultimately, that gives you a better and better perspective of what the actual situation is out. And I think this is what we're ultimately interested in, is trying to get closer and closer to an understanding of this blue fuzzy line, modulo all of the issues about interpretation and so on. But I think this is ultimately what we're interested in. And of course, as an evil multinational company, we will design a product based on a generalized statement such, like that. And then I think what our job is, people in this room who are interested in finding new solutions, is to actually take that understanding, but then adapt it to new, different kinds of cultures. So that is my schematic. And this is a quote that I found from Clifford Geertz when I was cramming for this panel. And I thought it was great because it is really kind of what I think we're after in this particular debate. Thank you.
So now we're switching to the mode where you guys get to fight and discuss gently with each other. Yeah, I have some follow-up comments. One quote from Geertz that I thought about mentioning. Geertz was sort of he was a very famous, very influential anthropologist. And he also was someone who really edged towards rejecting the value of generalizability entirely. And a very famous quote from Geertz about this question of generalizability and whether it was important to be able to take a study in a village and relate it to something else. He said, kind of as a dismissive response, the value of anthropology is another nation heard from, period. Another nation heard from. We're getting at the diversity of the world bit by bit, and that's the value of that kind of work. I think we're moving towards a point of agreement about generalizability. I do. But I do think there's a big question here, which is, what is a non-generalizable ICTD project? And if we can't come up with one, I'm not sure that criteria is very valuable to apply in evaluating research. Same with what is a non-replicable ICTD study, right? We're all, I think, very committed to field-based research. And because of that, we're going to have to, make compromises about what we claim is replicable and what we claim is generalizable, because we can't control these environments. It's the field. It's complex and beautiful and, uncontrollable. I think I agree pretty much entirely on rigor. I just think that if we were to include that in a list of criteria, we'd have to lay it out. We'd have to describe what rigor might mean in different methodological approaches. Because I think the kind of work I do, by someone who's not, doesn't have a background in that kind of research, people look at it and say that it's not rigorous because I'm not using tables and I'm not putting numbers in there, and I seem to be just interviewing people at random. And there is a systematic process that I pursue, but you have to understand what that process is to be able to recognize the rigor. I think, rather than talking about replicability and verifiability, what if we replace that with the term transparency, which I absolutely agree is a criteria we should include in evaluating research. Are the methods transparent? Do we know how people arrived at the conclusions that they came to? And if you have a transparent, if you're transparent about the methods you use, then a graduate student would be able to take that set of processes and try it over again and see what happened. So I wanted to throw that additional term into the mix.
Okay, so I think so. A couple of interesting things are around, what would not be considered generalizable, right, under the definition that I'm proposing. So for example, an example would be, and you might be able to argue with this, but an example would be biography, right? So if you pick one human being and really study them with the same depth that you are studying, let's say, a particular group of people, I think some of that generalizability is lost. In other words, now you're talking about a very single individual, and they might still contribute to your larger picture of, where humanity ends and so forth, but it's not, you don't know whether what you've learned about that person is applicable to other people. Whereas I think when you study a community, even though you're only talking to, let's say, 100 people in that community, you're expecting that people from a very similar culture will have similar attributes as the 100 people that you spoke to. With respect to rigor and replicability, I think some of this is terminology and how it pushes wrong buttons in different communities. Transparency, I think, is definitely good. One thing I want to say is that all of these words were not meant to be binary cutoffs, where you either had generalizability or not, you either have replicability or not, but they were really meant to be smooth continuum, where the stronger work tends to have better transparency, if we decide to call it transparency. In other words, I think there's plenty of bad research where people are not transparent about their methods, or where they're not rigorous in the way that they conduct even qualitative research, right? I don't think it's a question of whether you have numbers and charts. It's really a question of, did you do the interviews in such a way that you're, removing as much of the bias of your own, cultural background as possible, or even if you have that bias, that you're at least acknowledging it. I think those kinds of things are, again, different from different disciplines. It's probably worth it to put those out, but at least given the length of the document, I decided not to do that. Plus, I'm not really an expert in more than a couple of the disciplines that are involved. And then the last thing was with respect to I think so I think, that's basically it. For all of those things, I think it's really a continuum. And it's not even that any given piece of work needs to have everything at a high degree. In fact, I think it would be difficult for everybody to continuously have high degrees of all of the different axes. But I think stronger work will tend to have more along a certain axis. And I was actually a little bit concerned when you said that, I was going to change the way I wrote my paper, because I actually think people are doing very well, especially in this community, with respect to being rigorous, with respect to looking for interesting results that go at least somewhat beyond the individuals that you spoke to, and so on and so forth.
Do you want to? We should probably let the. Well, I actually had an initial question. Do you think there's a difference between ICTD research in general and the types of papers and the types of research that would be appropriate for the ICTD conference? What makes good ICTD research, and if there's a specific kind of research that would be appropriate for the ICTD conference?
But compared to what?
Compared to other publications, ITID, ITD, the broad range of research that is done by ICTD practitioners in general. Is there a difference between, does ICTD, that conference, actually represent the broad range of research that is done by ICTD practitioners? Is it meant to represent?
Yeah, hopefully as it evolves. Hopefully as the conference evolves, it will increasingly represent, a broad scope of ICTD. I think, it's it's one of these things where you know it when you see it. One thing that I would say often is not ICTD is where it's only ICT. So if you end up writing a paper where it's, highly technical, and you didn't test it in the field, and it's not even designed for people in a developing community, I would say it's not ICTD. And conversely, if it's all about development, but there's no mention of technology, I would say it's probably not ICTD. So I think it's really the intersection, of those things. And I think the interesting and exciting thing about ICTD is that aside from that intersection, it doesn't matter what disciplinary background you come from.
What do you think are the gaps right now?
I'll let actually Jenna respond.
The gaps?
Well, in terms of the broad range of what we are trying to publish as ICTD practitioners, are there gaps in what we're able to?
Just looking at the ICTD conference proceedings, comparing that to the ITID journal, there seems like there's a lot less discussion of matters of policy, for one thing. And a lot less, I think, if I'm remembering the proceedings correctly, a lot less about some of these development institutions and their perspective on the field, and events like WISIS that are taking place within these development institutions. I see less of that at the ICTD conference than in other ICTD venues, I guess. I'm not sure why that is. I think people are probably pretty familiar with this tension between ICT 4D versus ICT-D, and ICT and D, right? For or and. And I think for is a bit more bounded of a field than and. And I think I ally myself with and rather than for, because I think and is the space where we can kind of question the paradigm, and we can question what it means to do development, to be people who want to develop other people. And as long as we're staying honest about that discussion, I think we'll, keep ourselves out of trouble. Some of the troubles that have afflicted a lot of people trying to, promote projects that they think are going to improve situations. Yeah.
Let me just say that I was the one who strongly argued for ICT and D, so.
So we only have one mic, so if people could just stand up, ask their questions, and I'm going to just repeat it into the mic. Eric?
So this is certainly a topic I've thought about a lot. And I have social science students and technical students. I can't say I've gotten social science students all that well, but I have some helpers. But a few things struck me, maybe students will comment on. One thing that struck me is that, unbeknownst to me when I got into this, generally speaking, engineers are interventionists and social scientists are observers. And the two don't really go together all that much. Right? Are you there to observe or are you there to interfere? I'm always there to interfere. So we have a little bit of ways to deal with that. The best way I know of seems to be to do a non-interfering pre-study. You can see what the effect of interference ends up being, which no one really does, frankly. But if you can do it the right way, I think that will be the right way. But that's kind of the best I was able to get. And then, so I've kind of been pushing my social science students to ask questions like, what would be the interventionist things you would do based on what you observe, even if you don't do them? And that's been interesting. I'd also say, and again, very polemic, more than intended, is that I found a lot of social science literature I read to be critical in a non-constructive way. Again, as an interventionist, that's not helpful. It's actually much easier to criticize projects than to suggest realistic improvements. And I don't know how the rest of social science, I don't think social science has ever been required to fix the problems they criticize. And that's fine. I don't know how to fix them. But I mean, that's one of the tensions I had in my own group. And I actually see it just, even Berkeley's anthropology department has a famous fight between different kinds of anthropology, let alone the spotter stuff. Some of it's the same issues.
So I would intervene here to say that social scientists certainly do intervene and try to resolve problems, and they call that social movements, and they call it activism, right? Okay. It's not necessarily in a technological form, but certain. Very much so. In many cases it is. Very much it is, following from research sometimes. So, yeah. I don't think it's always as easy to critique as you think it might be. And not, it's not as easy to critique well. And when you see, yeah, right. It bothers me as well when people critique and criticize and then it seems like the solution is that you just don't do anything, right? Which there are moral questions about that as well, I think. What else do I have to say to that? It's very tricky when you have a team of social scientists and engineers, and the social scientists are there to critique what the engineers are doing, right? It's a lot easier for me as a social scientist to critique something that someone else did, and that makes everyone get along better, right? So it's a great space for me to work in to study the diffusion of mobile phones and how people use internet cafes, and no one's sort of being targeted by any kind of criticism I might have in that space. And those are kind of team collaboration. Yeah, those are kind of team collaboration difficulties that, yeah. I think there's actually emerging in this space some great opportunities for intervention to become a kind of social science research. And people are beginning to explore that. Melissa over here is someone who's doing that. To put a technology in place in order to understand something about the social dynamics of an environment. That's a really rich area that I would love to see lots of social scientists and engineers to work together and go into. Because then it's not about does this technology work or not, is it good or not. It's about what do we know about this community now that we've put some sort of phone-based system here, right? And that can kind of sidestep, I think, some of those conflicts you might have about an evaluator coming in and ripping apart something that someone spent a long time and put a lot of energy into building. So.
I actually think the potential interaction between social scientists and people who are trying to solve problems through an engineering channel are actually even much richer than just having social scientists identify problems and then engineers fixing them. I actually think that criticism is all 100% good, actually. Even if we ultimately as interventionists don't think the criticism is valid, I think it's still important that we hear it. Just because there are a lot of times when people rush in to try to fix problems and don't realize that they're also crushing other issues on the side. And so I think that criticism is actually very valuable. Obviously, it helps if it's constructive instead of, oh, you guys are evil and why are you doing this? But I think nevertheless it's important to hear. In fact, some of the best feedback we get is of a very critical nature, and I think it helps the engineers understand that there are issues that they may be overlooking. Yeah, I think there's a lot richer interaction between people coming from a social science background and a technology background. I actually discourage Nimi and Jonathan, who both have social science backgrounds in my group, from trying to go out of their way to figure out what kind of intervention would make sense, simply because I think that discussion needs to happen with people in the room who also understand the technology. And if they do it in a one-sided way, they end up giving us a narrow view of what they think, when actually their understanding of that space is much richer. And I think that dialogue is really what brings out some of the more interesting discussions. So, one thing I would say is, we never leave a meeting where everybody in the room has agreed to anything. But the discussion in the room has changed, the way people see things. And I think that discussion is really the most valuable thing about having different disciplines in the room.
I will say, to be clear, that I think the interaction among students has been fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that's taught me a lot. I'm just trying to explain what the challenge is going in.
In the back?
Yeah, thanks for a very limited discussion. So I think the one question I have, generally going to be general answer to, and your perspective on it, and also maybe other people in the audience also. So the question is, I think what's inherent in Eric's question, and also inherent in some of the differences between your opinions, is the question of temperament, and the question of why do we do what we do? What's the goal we have behind our work? What gets us up in the morning? Is it to understand the state of the world, objectively understand what's going on, how does the world react? Does it affect change? Do we actually want to make a difference? And is ICTD, at the end of the day, is it an activity and knowledge acquisition, or is it an activist movement that seeks to change the world? I don't think there's any general answer to that, but I'd like to know what the academics in the room, what the people in the panel think is your role in that process.
So I think this is a question that is entirely about applicability. And as I mentioned, I think there's a continuum of applicability. There's information that is ultimately applicable. It's like pure mathematics, where maybe 200 years later somebody finds an application for it, but is not immediately actionable. And I think that kind of research is absolutely critical to do, and it's part of ICTD as much as the kind of work where the day after you learn the piece of information, you're actually going to make an impact on somebody's lives. The reason why I keep saying this is I come from an environment, which is a corporate research lab, and as in an academic environment, you don't realize what it means to have to fight for open research and why it's valuable. Within the context of a company, the question is very similar to, should we do research that doesn't immediately impact product? And it's the same issue. The research that you do that looks like it doesn't have any application today still ultimately feeds into more applicable research later. And it's critical that you're doing both, or else I think you're limiting the scope of the kinds of different work that you're ultimately doing.
I mean, just one second. I think maybe within that answer, I'm asking specifically why you, Kentaro and Toyama, do what you do. Right? That's what I'm specifically asking, right?
I'll answer what I, Jenna Varel, do. I think there's a division of labor issue implicit in that question. I observe, I study, I want to understand communities where technologies exist, where technologies might exist. I think that work takes so much time and energy that I'm just going to do that. And what I'm going to do in order to change the world is try to communicate that to people as clearly and as best as I can. I think there's, it's hard to know from my own perspective. It feels like the balance is more on the side of building things for a lot of people, and that maybe that's more glamorous. I'm not sure if I'm perceiving that right, but it feels almost like a kind of a moral statement for me to decide I'm just going to try and understand people first and foremost, and I'm not going to spend any energy on building things, because I think that by itself takes a lot of time and energy to do right. And in order to build things, I will try to communicate that to people and do the best I can to make it so that they can build and change the world in a way that is accurate, very accurate.
Yeah, so I 100% support people like Jenna doing the work that she's doing within the context of ICTD as research. Why do I do this? I do it because I find research compelling, and I would like to do research in an area that is ultimately likely to make an impact on development. But in a research lab, we're actually somewhat constrained in the degree to which we're ultimately going to have impact. It's neither our mandate or the way we're resourced to actually change the lives of millions of people ourselves. And so I see my role as being, again, it's a division of labor, and we're doing that part which helps to identify both existing relationships with technology as well as potential interventions with technology, and to really rigorously test both the understanding as well as actual interventions. And then to the extent that we do that, I think it helps inform people who are interested in getting their hands really dirty and doing work that doesn't ultimately may not contribute to research, but it may contribute significantly to impact. So I think it's a question of division of labor. I agree with that.
I have one more thing to add, actually. I've spent enough time talking to Ghanaians who use the internet and for other projects to know that they've expressed to me over and over again very strong concerns about representation, how Africans, how Ghanaians are represented in the world, and sort of real struggles with the way the Western media represents those groups. And I feel like there's really something lost if we just focus on these communities as places with needs, places where people don't have things. And so I think another contribution of what I try to do is to give a broader picture of what people are doing besides, finding prices for crops on their mobile phone, but also that they're using the internet to look at music videos. They're producing and spreading their own music videos. They've got their own commentary on these changes that are sweeping through their countries. And that, I think, that's not a sort of doing something in the world and making a change, but it is sort of an attempt to correct representational injustice, I guess. So.
And then the other thing I would say is, I'm not just not reading into anything that Tapan said, but I think to the point of the moral imperative of doing this kind of work, I would say if you're sitting in this room, you're not 100% committed to real on the ground impact through the means that you're doing it. I think you might be sitting at a point where you have a lot of leverage to change those things, but if people are very interested in actually having impact, directly, I would say. Academia is not the optimal place to do that. Having said that, I think research has a tremendous capacity to change what people are doing. The problem with just working on impact is that you might blindly be executing something that could be done better if somebody came along and found a more efficient way to do it.
So we're going to have to continue this conversation tomorrow in an audience panel, which will be moderated by TAP. And what we're going to do is invite each of you to actually submit your definition of research in ICTD. And so we're going to have two of these little boxes outside sort of by the food during the ICTD social tonight and during the coffee hour and the poster session this afternoon. And what you can do is either, on these index cards or on whatever piece of paper you want if you need more space, you can just fold them up and then put them in these jars in this basket and then put them in there, and we'll just read them over tonight and take out whatever we thought was interesting. And if you put your name on it, we might ask you to present them tomorrow. And we have half an hour basically tomorrow, so it'll be fast. So just put them in. But thank you, Jenna and Kentaro.